Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It is our privilege to have with us today our first keynote speaker, Professor Manu Kapoor, Director of the Singapore ETH Center and Professor for Learning Sciences and Higher Education at ETH Zurich, Switzerland. Early in his academic career, Prof. Manu also directed an interactive and digital media research and development program at the Ministry of Education of Singapore, catalyzing interdisciplinary research on interactive and digital media in education throughout the country.
Today, Prof. Manu's keynote address is titled Productive Failure and the Future of Teaching and Learning. Let us put our hands together to warmly welcome him on stage.
Prof. Manu, please.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me. A big part of this, and I've told many of you I've met, this has been a homecoming. I was a teacher for 6 years in the Singapore schools, first at Pioneer Secondary School, then at National Junior College for many years. Then I went to do my PhD and came back and worked at NIE, together with my colleagues at NIE and MOE colleagues and schools. So really to come back after 10 years of leaving Singapore, to have this audience with teachers and colleagues, this is really personal. It's a real honor, and it's a real homecoming. I look forward to catching up with you, but first I promised I will give a talk, so allow me some space. Right? So as a learning scientist, what I do is I investigate the fundamental mechanisms of human cognition, of human learning, right from the physiological, to brain behavior, to cognitive, to affective, to embodied, to social and cultural mechanisms. That's one half of my job. The second half of my job is to take those understandings about human learning and translate them into practical applications and interventions in the classrooms, in the lecture halls, where learning actually takes place. And one of those methods, or one of those interventions that I've dedicated my research career throughout for the last 20 years is productive failure. And that's one of the things that I will talk about today. So as I said, I used to be a teacher, math teacher, and my philosophy for teaching math was really very straightforward, very simple. I thought if I could engage my students, explain to them the new concepts that I'm teaching them in a very clear and engaging manner, in a logically structured manner, show them exactly how to apply those concepts, then surely they should see what I'm trying to show them. Surely they would understand. And some of them did. And when you tested them afterwards in homework exercises or exams or assessments, if you looked at the kinds of questions that were covered during the lectures and the tutorials, they had no problems going through that. But the moment you change something, you change a small parameter, you change the context of the situation, they faltered. And I wondered, is that something wrong with me? Is that something wrong with them? Are there certain assumptions I'm making that were not valid about how I was going about teaching? And it turned out, as I went to do my PhD studies, this is a well-reported, well-documented phenomena in the learning sciences. People have gone into math classrooms of very good teachers by all accounts. They've studied how they teach. The evaluation of the teaching is almost superlative, both by their peers and, more importantly, by the very students who are attending those lectures. They say, I've really understood. This was a really interesting lecture. But immediately after, when people tried to probe understandings, conceptual understanding of what they were learning, that was found to be really shallow. Why was that? Isn't it obvious? Isn't it intuitive that if you don't know something, isn't the best way to just clearly tell you exactly what it is? Why does that lead to shallow understanding? And so as a scientist, you first need to be able to articulate the problem very clearly before you can attempt to solve it. And so the problem of learning that I was dealing with the problem is not that we learn poorly from bad lectures. Of course, do not give bad lectures. I hope that was obvious. But the problem of learning is counterintuitive. The problem of learning, it turns out, when you're first coming to understand something new, and this is going to hit you, is that we learn poorly from very good ones. And that's the problem we need to solve. Why is it? The very intuitive idea that I can directly explain something I'm the expert, you're the novice, I can explain to you in very clear and engaging ways, and that is still something that leads to poor learning or shallow understandings. Why does that happen? So let's unpack that. There are many, many reasons, but let's unpack some of the cognitive aspects of it. First has to do with this idea of seeing things. So here's a thought experiment. Imagine you're watching a movie. It's a very entertaining, very engaging movie. You're at the edge of your seat. You come out of the cinema and I ask you a question. Hey, did you watch that movie? And if there was an acclaimed director sitting next to you who watched the same movie, would they have watched the same movie as you? Chances are you would say, well, yeah, I was sitting next to the acclaimed director. I saw the same movie as they did. But if I asked you the question, did you see what the director saw? Then you would say no. It's the same perceptual stimulus. It's the same movie. It's the same set of frames in the same sequence. But the director would see very different things from a novice. The director would see deep structure, deep features, which are right in front of you, but you still cannot see them as a novice. And decades of research comparing experts and novices in a number of domains, whether you're looking at a piece of mathematics proof or a piece of art or poetry or historical analysis, an engineering drawing, the same perceptual stimulus, when experts look at it versus novices look at it, experts see deep structure, deep features. Novices tend to rely on superficial aspects. And therein lies the novice's paradox, the learning paradox. Because seeing is not just a perceptual exercise. Our lives as teachers would be so much easier if the human cognitive architecture had evolved to make seeing simply a perceptual exercise. We all see the same thing, but we don't. Seeing is a cognitive exercise. We see with the knowledge that we have. Now think about a novice. Think about the student in your classroom. You want them to see what is critical. What is the deep structure? But to see that, they have to have the very knowledge that they do not have. That's why our jobs as teachers is so difficult. So the question is, if you just understand this one principle from the cognitive sciences, the first job of teaching, therefore, is not to teach, is not to tell. The first job of teaching is to prepare the novice to see what you want them to see. How do you do that? But that's the first problem we need to solve, the problem of seeing or noticing. But that's not all. We need to be able to see the critical features, but also connect them with what we know. That's how the mind processes information. It takes new information and connects it to what we know. And this is when we say, oh, the importance of prior knowledge. And this is a very key mechanism. Let me illustrate this with another, not quite a thought experiment, but a memory test for all of you. Are you ready? It's a trivial example, but I'm going to give you a number of statements of the form, who did what? And you'll have to remember who did what. I'm going to give you about 1 second per statement. And this is a fairly smart crowd. All right? So here we go. Are you ready? Okay, even if you say nothing, you are ready. Okay, time's up. I know some of you are really competitive. I know this is Singapore. But if we were to aggregate the results, I could say a few patterns that would exist. Chances are, if you try to recall, you would probably remember the first couple, you might remember the last couple, and maybe something that stuck out to you because that's something personal to you. But on average, you'll get about half, maybe just above half number right. Okay? And this is it's to remember so many statements. This is not an easy memory exercise, so you've done well if you've got about half. What if I told you, with a small tweak, with a small trick, I can hack your memory, give you another set of new statements, and I guarantee all of you will remember all the statements accurately and effortlessly. How's that? Yay? Let's go. Ready? All right. And now if I jumble up everything, everybody can recall everything perfectly. I did not change your working memory capacity in those 1 or 2 seconds, did I? What I did, in a very trivial way, made certain assumptions about your priors and invited and activated those priors to remember you a lot more, so that you could remember a lot more that you even thought was possible. And that is the principle that we more broadly apply when we want to teach something new. Because part of the reason a child has difficulty processing new information is because they're trying to search for priors to connect it with. Okay? So that's the second reason why it's very hard. So you've got to help them see, and you've got to help them connect, very simply put. But there's a third beast, and that's called transfer. You need to learn something, not that you just understand it deeply, but you also need to be able to apply it more widely to novel context. Because if you can't, then what's the point of learning? If you can only do what you're told. You need to be able to transfer. So here's a shed. It's a carpentry shed. Imagine the apprentice and the masters are working together. And the master says, look, you can't come to the carpentry shed unless you go and learn some mathematics. Because number systems, geometry, etc. are very important for learning carpentry. Or while you're at it, learn some physics. Because forces, geometry, and so on and so forth are also very important for carpentry. Oh, and also learn some chemistry, because you'll be dealing with materials interact. They have that habit, and therefore learn some chemistry as well. And once you've aced all of that, come to carpentry, and I'll teach you everything there is about carpentry. Hopefully that's not what happens. Hopefully, the master says, come and join me in the activity of carpentry, and I'll teach you everything, math, physics, chemistry, dealing with obnoxious customers, all of it in the activity of carpentry. Why am I sharing this with you? Because we used to think that knowledge is like a file in the computer. That once you have it from one situation, you can easily access and use it in another situation. But in fact, what we know from theories of cognition, that knowledge gets situated in the practices, in what you're doing. So if you learn math or science or history and geography by listening, then that knowledge is tied to the activity of listening. By the same account, if you learn the same knowledge through problem solving, through collaboration, through design, through reflection, the same knowledge gets tied to those particular doings or those particular practices. And part of the reason why knowledge does not transfer from one context to the other is because the contexts within which we learn something are very different from the context within which we use. That's why you see employers lament, or you've learned so much in school but you can't apply in the workplace. And that is perfectly predictable based on theories of situated cognition. That the practices in school within which that knowledge is embedded are not the practices at work and in life. So you have the knowledge in some way, but it's not accessible, it's not usable. What we need, if we want transfer, is to make some overlap. It doesn't have to be a perfect overlap, but there has to be some overlap so that transfer can take place. You know, a simple way of understanding is the home advantage effect. You know, anybody who watches sport, in any sport, would know that, you know, teams generally do better at home than away, right? Unless you're Manchester United. I'm a Man United fan. I'm suffering. Have mercy. I'm allowed to make that joke. But that's the idea. Why is it that the same skill sets, the same gameplay, so the same players, same rules of the game, why is it different in a different context? Because we encode information. Our knowledge and skills get situated. It doesn't mean we can't transfer, but transfer is aided when there's more overlap. Okay? So 3 things. And these are the 3 things we need to, if I can make this work. Okay. So there was the problem of learning, if you still remember, that we learn poorly even from very good lectures. And the reason for those things, at least minimally, is that we are not prepared to see things. We are not explicitly, deliberately trying to connect with what our students already know. And we are not engaging them in the kinds of practices and context which allow for transfer to take place. Right, so how do we solve this problem? And as a scientist, again, I go back to science. So let me take you through a whirlwind learning sciences course. This will take you a year to learn, but I'll do it in 15 minutes. And don't be angry with me. So what does science say? So let's go back to about 50 years. All of you are familiar with the idea of scaffolding, I'm sure. This is a group that is really familiar with the idea of scaffolding. And that's where it really starts, and I'll start there. What is Vygotskian zone of proximal development? There are some things in the green circle that I can do without any help. I already have the expertise. I don't need any help for that. There's some things in the outer pink circle that no matter how much you give me help, I'm not going to be able to do it. It's like doing salsa. I have 2 right feet. No help is going to work. Right? But there's something in between, in that orange circle. Here is a zone where I can't do currently without any help, but with some help and guidance, I will be able to do it. And that's called the zone of proximal development. And when you enter that zone, that's when the idea of scaffolding and supporting the learner comes in. The question, it's a very simple framework. Everybody loves it. The question is, how do you enter that zone? How do you go from the zone where you can do things without any help to the zone where you need help? As a teacher, how do you know that your students are in that zone? If you give a student a task, a problem to solve, or an essay to write, or something in any other domain, and they're able to do it successfully, have they entered the zone? No. They're still in the zone where they can do this without help. If you make it a little bit harder and they're still able to do it, have they entered the zone? No, they're still in that green zone. You have to make things progressively harder until you reach a point where you start to see that here is something they cannot do. And what is that thing? That is information not about success. That is information from failure. You need demonstrable information about what is it that a child cannot do without help, failure, before you can even proceed to think about scaffolding someone. You need to know what is it that they cannot do. So failure, although Vygotsky doesn't talk about it, in future work, 1976, Wood, Brunner, and Ross, they also do not talk about it in this sense, but failure is at the core of some of the basic work we do as teachers, like scaffolding. Right? You need that information. Remember that. The second thing, which almost stands out, is minimal guidance. What do I mean by that? Once the learner is in that zone, you want to help them. You have a choice. Do you help them a little, or do you help them a lot? If a child is learning how to walk, do you hold their hands and then you make them walk across? Oh, look, you've learned how to walk. Or do you give them a little pinky finger and say, try your best, mate. Get up, hold on, and let's go. Both are help. Which one do you use as a teacher? The principle is, as long as the bulk of the cognitive effort or even the physical effort is on the learner without giving up, that's when they will learn. And this may seem counterintuitive to us as teachers because we are very nice people, we want to help. We end up helping a lot. Whereas what you really need to get away with is the least amount of help possible by placing the bulk of the effort on the learner. And if that doesn't work, then you increase the help slowly. So progressively, minimal guidance is what we need to do if you want to scaffold well. And this is something we've known for more than 50 years. Contrast that with how we design lessons and learning today. Okay? Think about that. But we move on. People love to study children at play because these are some of the natural propensities, very strong propensities for learning and making sense of the world. And there are some fascinating studies in child development psychology that give us some insight into human cognition. But I choose these particular ones. And I call this the play effect. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine you're all young kids, 4 or 5-year-old. And you all love to play with toys. Who doesn't? Suppose I divide you down the middle. Sorry, Minister. And to your right is group 2. And to your left is group 1. Everybody here is group 1. And everybody to the right here is group 2. Right? So I go to group 1 first. I say, hey kids, here's a new toy. You've never seen it. You've never played with it. Would you like to play with it? All right, never mind. I'm nice. Here's the toy. Play with it. Figure out how it works. Play as you like. And I observe you. That's group 1. Here's group 2. And I said, here kids, here's a new toy. You've never seen it. You've never played with it. Would you like to play with it? Learn, people. Learn. Thank you for that enthusiasm. But then I say, but this is a new toy. You've never seen it. You've never played with it. Let me show you, okay, how to play with it. Watch and learn. And I show you how to play with it. If you press this, this happens. This is how it works. This is how it makes a sound. This is how it makes a click. Learned it? Now I let you play with it. Play as you like. 2 experiments. 2 groups. Which group would spend more time engaged with the toy? Which one would be more inventive and creative in playing with this toy? 1. Who will invent strategies that mimic science, hypothetical deductive strategies, to figure out how the toy works? 1. This is surprising, given the lack of enthusiasm from these people. Seriously surprising. And you're still saying they will do better. But you're right, your intuitions as teachers and educators is bang on right. That's exactly what happens, right? And this is a really robust in child development and child play, the play effect, so much so that it's won the Nobel Prize for Cognitive Science, Alison Gopnik's work. So very robust findings. Now imagine knowledge, concepts, ideas, not as tangible toys, although they could be, but as conceptual toys. And part of creativity, deep learning, comes with playing and tinkering and failing, trying to understand, trying to make sense of this new toy. What do we do in the classroom? 1 or 2? 2. It's okay if you have to say it. What do we do in the classroom? 2. It's okay to say it, because that's what I did too. Right? It's a play effect. So the point is, there is something about playing and tinkering before learning. Let's continue with this line of thought. There's this body of work on the generation effect, right? And looking at how generation, does it help memory or not? Does it help us remember and retain information? So again, I'm going to give you a word pair test, right? Imagine you have these are word pairs, so you have the stem, rapid, and you have to guess what the pair is, okay? I'm going to be nice, and I'm going to say the pair is a synonym. I'm sorry, yeah. Okay, so can you think of pairs that are synonyms? I'm going to be even nicer and say that the first letter of the pair starts with the letter F. Say it out loud. Thank you. Now imagine I do this experiment where with group 1, I give them 40 of such pairs, but instead of asking them to generate anything, I'll give them rapid, fast, X, Y, A, B. I give them all the words. All I ask you to do is study and memorize. You don't need to generate. It's already given. For group 2, I give you the first word and with a couple of hints, and I say, you generate, and then I will show you that you're right, so correct. Same amount of time. The only difference is for the first few seconds, I got them to generate. You studied the same list of words. And if a day later I were to test you, what were the words? Well, by giving you the stem and asking you to generate the pair, who do you think would do better? The ones who had time to study and memorize, or the ones who had to generate and then learn it? Hands up. Group 1. Almost nobody, one person. Group 2. Okay. And that's exactly how the results pan out. Okay, so there's something about when you're trying to retain information, if you want to memorize something, instead of just studying something, or instead of being told, there's something about generating that's actually useful for memory and how you encode information. And it gets better, because you don't even have to generate the correct thing. Okay, I'm sorry. Is it? All right, it works. Right, so like I said, you don't even have to generate the correct thing. If I gave you a word called, the stem is whale, and ask you to generate the response, think of anything. What goes with whale? Could be many, many things. And I just ask you to generate. Have you generated? Okay. Now if I tell you, actually the correct word that I was looking for was mammal. Did anyone have mammal? Okay, some of you. But 99% had an associate word, but it was not the correct one that I was thinking of. Now imagine I do the same experiment where to one group, I give them whale, mammal. All these words, pairs, and ask them, study and memorize. And to this group, I say, whale, guess whatever wildly comes to your mind, and then I will show you the correct word, the correct answer, and then you memorize that. It goes on. You will almost invariably fail to produce the correct response because the association is very tenuous. And yet, when you look at the results, who would remember the words better? Is it going to be the ones that were told and they got more time to actually study and memorize, or the people who wildly guessed, got it wrong, and then they were given the correct answer? By now you see the pattern. If anybody still leans towards group 1, you're not in this talk anymore. Right? It's group 2. So it's like, when you go to a party, or even at the conference, I would encourage you to throw your name cards away, walk up to a random person, and say, hi, are you Tom? I say, no, I'm not Tom, I'm John. I say, oh, I'm sorry. And they will ask you, hey, are you Mark? I says, no, I'm not Mark, I'm Manu. And chances are that you will remember the names of people you meet much better if you did it that way. And from a cognitive standpoint, I'm not kidding. We do party introductions, networking, all wrong. You thought this was a science of learning course. And the answer is simple. The reason is simple. Because the next time I have to remember John, I would go and say, oh, I called you Tom, but you're John. That's one path. Or I might just be lucky and say, oh, I remember you as John. So I have two paths to the same body of knowledge. Whereas if I just know you as John, well, that's kind of, John, you have to be really interesting if I need to remember you, right? And that's the idea. You're creating multiple paths for retrieval even when the information that you generated is failed, it's incorrect. So there is something about generating even the wrong answer before learning. But this is just memory. People have studied actual problem solving, whether you're doing it in math, in physics, in writing, and in other cases. In this case, this particular study comes from physics. People have studied tutorial interactions. Don't we love tutorials in Singapore, right? Around the world. Imagine a tutor sitting down with a tutee. And as the tutee does something, tries to solve a problem or write something, as a tutor, you have the explanations. You can choose to give those explanations at any point in time. But what's a good time to give that explanation? And people have studied this systematically, and it turns out that the same feedback or correct explanation, if you were to give it at a point in time where the tutee is not at an impasse or is not stuck, it will not lead to any learning. It's only when you see the tutee stuck, there is something that they cannot move forward with. And if the same explanation, your expert knowledge, if that comes in at that point in time, that's what leads to learning. So it really pays to get stuck. Because when you're stuck, when you're at an impasse, and if you're lucky enough that at that point in time, somebody gives you the right explanation, that's what leads to learning. In and of itself, an explanation timed otherwise does not. What this means is that there is a time, hopefully, to get stuck, because that creates what my colleagues call a time for telling. It is important, telling is important, but timing the telling is the science behind it, right? So we've gone through studying scaffolding, where to support somebody, you've got to get them to the failure zone, and then support them minimally. We've seen how children play and how there's something about generating and tinkering, and even if you don't get to the right way of figuring out what the toy or the idea is. We saw how generation aids memory, even generating the wrong answer aids memory. And we've seen that correct explanations and instructions do not have an effect on learning unless you're stuck. This is the whole body of research that was begging to be taken advantage of, and that's what brought me into thinking about failure. The idea is, if getting stuck, if reaching an impasse, if failure is so compelling for learning, if reaching that point is a necessary condition for learning, then why do we wait for failure to happen? Why don't we design for it? And if we could, what would that design look like? And so together with my colleague Kate Belachik, who was at the NIE when I was there, we developed a two-phase design for productive failure. The first is the problem-solving phase, where we engage students in problem-solving activities that are designed like Group 1. You get to play with a specific toy in a constrained way, but I configure the toy in a way that you can never figure it out. That means no matter what you do, you will fail. Okay? Followed by instruction, because after you've done that, then I will show you how the toy works, how to play. Okay? So let me give you an example of how it unfolds in the classroom. Suppose you're in a math classroom, and you're learning the concept of standard deviation. These are numbers, right? Many math teachers, including myself, would have gone into this classroom and said, standard deviation, that's a particularly complex formulation. Surely students do not know that. Because if I ask the student, calculate the standard deviation of these football players, these strikers over the years, they'll say, what? What is standard deviation? I don't know about this. And from this, I can conclude that their prior knowledge is just not there. And therefore, they have nothing to connect with. And the only choice for me as a teacher is now to just tell you. Now imagine I ask the same question, but in a slightly different way. I say, here's a bunch of players, here's how many goals they've scored over the number of years. Invent as many ways of deciding who's the most consistent striker. There's no mention of standard deviation, there's no mention of formal language. It is designed to appeal to the intuitive, experiential resources that students bring to the classroom. Now, what do you think students would do? And this is data that comes from Singapore, India, US, Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia. Almost 150,000 students. What do you think students do? And students across the globe are remarkably similar in what they do. I'll show you. They try to do totals and averages. I'm not teaching you math, but this is for illustrative purposes, right? They try to do totals and averages. But we've designed the data in a way that when they do that, they find that all of them are the same. This is deliberate. There's a science to it. Because you want that knowledge to be activated, but you don't want the problem to be solvable by that knowledge. So it reaches an impasse. Remember, we said impasse is important. Failure is important. This is intentional design for that failure, while activating the knowledge they can connect with. They do tallying and box plots and say, yeah, that's a good way to feel the problem, but still it's not mathematically solving it correctly. They draw graphs and they say, what are you doing here? And say, oh, if it goes up and down a lot, it's inconsistent. So yeah, that's a great way to feel the problem. Can you mathematize it? Can you quantify it? They take maximum value, minimum value. They take the difference between the maximum and the minimum. We know that they're going to do it, so we keep that invariant. Again, they reach an impasse. This is intentional design for failure while activating priors. They start to take year-on-year differences, and they add up all the differences. Very clever, very intuitive. No textbook has the solution, but it's a very intuitive solution. Some of them recognize the large fluctuations are canceling out. So let's just ignore the magnitude. Let's just ignore the signs. Focus just on the magnitude. And they calculate the average magnitude. Again, not in any textbook, but a very intuitive solution. Sometimes crazy ideas come. Especially if you're a non-math teacher, you're going to love it. This is a group of students who were asked to quantify the graph. And they said, okay, imagine I could hold the ends of the graph. Imagine I could extend the graph in a rope. Imagine I could calculate the length of that rope. The longer the rope, the more inconsistent, right? People generally tend to laugh at this point because it's such an ingenious solution. So they've actually, you might have heard of this chap called Pythagoras, right, who's made life difficult for many of us. And they've divided into right-angle triangles, and they've calculated the hypotenuses, and they've got the length of the rope. To this day, I've never bothered to check the computation. Because the mathematics is not in the computation. Computationally, it makes nonsense. You can't combine numbers and goals in the same years and goals in the same metric. But it's in the play of imagination. It's that group 1 child who's trying to figure out that toy works, how this works, in very creative ways, whereas the group 2 child has already learned how to do it. And all of this is happening if it's designed really well. And I'm not going to go into the design aspects today, but if it is really designed well, then all of this is happening in 30, 40, 45 minutes prior to learning the concept that you're targeting. That's all. The question is, if students are able to produce this in a well-designed productive failure first phase, will it prepare them to see things when the teacher teaches? Will it prepare them to connect to their priors? Well, they've generated a lot of priors. Have they engaged in the kinds of mathematical problem-solving practices which would enable transfer? Theoretically, the answer to all three questions is yes. But we must test empirically. Theory is one thing, data is quite another. So you've carried out experiments comparing direct instruction, which is more like group 2, right? I will tell you what the concept is, I'll explain it to you, I'll show you how it works, and then I'll give you a chance to apply it and solve problems with it. Instruction followed by problem solving. Productive failure, think of it as an inversion, where it's like group 1, where I give them a very well-constrained, well-designed toy to explore and tinker, and it's designed in a way that you will fail to figure it out, but you will try many things. But then, after that, I show you how it works. And I compare these two. And our results show that when you look at basic fluency, the kinds of questions that come in tests and exams, both methods are very efficient at achieving high levels of basic fluency, 90% over. But where the differences start to emerge are on how deeply students understand those concepts and how they can transfer those concepts to novel situations. And that's where the effects are the largest. Right? So very large, big summary of my key findings is that productive failure outperforms direct instruction in a number of experiments on conceptual understanding and transfer without compromising basic knowledge. And this is what I call the basic knowledge fallacy. Why is it a fallacy? Because there is this belief that we must first learn our foundations and the basics before learning more complex and high order stuff. That part is all right. Okay? That's what we do. But there is a concomitant belief that it doesn't matter how you learn the basics, because it's the basics, just have it. We can build flexibility, deep understanding on top of it later on. That's a fallacy. Because what science is showing again and again, that you have two groups of students. Both appear very similar on basic knowledge, but very different in understanding and transfer. In other words, how you learn even the basics influences how well you understand it, how well you can transfer it. So the learning path matters. Okay? We also found the DI constraint, direct instruction constraints creativity. We asked direct instruction students to solve the same problem and say, invent as many ways of deciding who's the most consistent striker. What do you think they did? They gave us the correct solution that they'd learned. But they couldn't go beyond that. So this is again the creativity fallacy. We want creativity is at the top of the agenda of what we want to develop in our children. And if we are hoping that creativity is something that we develop later on, after the foundations have been developed, we've already shot ourselves in our own foot. That's what the science says. Right? Another thing that I come across is maybe things like productive failure and inquiry and other things are really good for the high ability students. So as a scientist, we go to different kinds of schools. Singapore is great because you have schools after PSLE, the variance between schools is less than the variance within schools is less than the variance between schools, creates a very good experimental comparison. And we got students who were somewhat 3 standard deviations far apart on the national exam, and we gave them the same productive failure interventions. And they were strikingly similar in terms of learning from PF. You could sort of mitigate the Matthew effect. The rich do not have to get richer. By deliberately activating priors, you can close the achievement gap. And the biggest finding that we have from teachers who have tried this out, and thank you to all of you in Singapore who have tried it out. I know there are many of you who have suffered through this. The biggest finding from teachers is, yes, this is, once they see the student work, they're really happy, but this is stressful. Design is a high level of expertise. But one feedback that we have from teachers is, I understand the math better. Okay? And there's a reason why. It's very easy to give what you know and tell what you know, the correct thing. But when you have to respond to students' ideas, students' thinking that may be correct, may not be correct, may be suboptimal, that's when your own domain knowledge is pushed in a deep way. And very quickly, this is not me. Science proceeds one failure at a time. I have a hypothesis. I have an experiment. Another scientist says, wait, I'm going to prove you wrong. And then they try to prove you wrong. And if their efforts to prove you wrong fail, well, you have two scientists saying, I have a consistent finding. Another lab comes around and says, I'm going to prove both of you wrong. If their efforts to fail, you accumulate evidence independently that is replicated and reproduced. And what we call truth, or our best theories, are really repeated attempts to fail something have failed. And that's what the truth is. And that's what we found in our experimental comparisons, in the meta-analysis, with very strong effects. And if I could put it in terms of what is achievable in education interventions, imagine the learning gain you will have with a good teacher, and imagine this learning gain is 1 unit. Then if you were to switch to productive failure, the average effect is twice that. And if you could carry out productive failure to high fidelity, the effect is 3 times that. Put it another way, a productive failure intervention would make your students appear 1 to 2 academic years ahead of their peers. This is not an incremental effect. This is a very strong effect. Okay? And although I've chosen to speak about mathematics, the effect is now across STEM domains. There's a lot of literature in language, which is basically productive failure, microcycles at work. In arts and humanities, medicine is a big one, where we're trying productive failure at ETH as well. Music, sport, in workplace learning, especially in the training of surgeons and pilots, where failure is really not possible. We design simulations where that can happen. Right? And workplace learning. So working with the Institute for Adult Learning to really take this out and design the upskilling work that goes on in Singapore and many other countries using productive failure models. So the work is expanded. Let's very quickly talk about why, the mechanisms. 4 A's. The minister earlier talked about the 4 F's, right? The challenges that we face. And productive failure works because of the 4 A's. And the first A is activation. I've talked about that. To process new information, you need to activate priors. We often assume the students have no priors. But finding out exactly what resources they bring is an art form. It's how you design, it's how you ask for it. Right? So activation is key. Because what activation does, it builds an awareness of a knowledge gap. I could try a number of things, they didn't work. That means there is something that does, and there's a gap between what I know and what I don't. There's a knowledge gap. That awareness itself is a very powerful mechanism. Because that creates an affect. And by affect, I mean both positive and negative affect. On the positive side, we've seen situational interest in finding out what the correct answer is, spike. The engagement improves. The motivation to understand, why is the teacher's method better than my method? I literally have students asking me that. The motivation to understand is better. Right? And they persist through that. On the negative side, if you try one thing, it doesn't work, another thing, it doesn't work, another thing, it doesn't work, it can be frustrating. It develops anxiety. It can be a little bit stressful. You may feel a bit of shame and guilt. But as long as this is done in a safe way, where the expectation is, hey, play and figure out things and don't worry about getting the right answer, if it's in that space, we found that some of these negative emotions to a small degree are actually predictive of strong learning outcomes. So we must not shy from these negative emotions as long as they're done in a safe space. Making learning easy does not necessarily ease learning. Learning is hard, learning is intentional, and we need to renorm that when people are learning something new, they should expect to struggle a little. They should expect to fail a little. They should expect to feel bad a little. In fact, they should turn it around and say, that's a good signal that I'm in the right zone. That's the mindset that we need to change. Imagine now you've got the knowledge activated, you're aware there's a gap, and there's this complex affective state primed for you to learn. And if at that point a teacher comes in and assembles the knowledge for you, puts the pieces together, that's your expertise. That's what brings it all together and makes the failure productive. If you don't do assembly, it all goes to waste. So the teacher's role is absolutely critical, both in the first phase and also in the second phase. All right? So that's the problems of learning, what the science has to say, and one method, one intervention that has been actually quite successful, even beyond my own expectations. So now let's take a turn towards what the future holds from my vantage point. I'm always afraid of doing this because you're almost proven, like you almost will fall flat on your face, but let's give it a go. Right? But first, I want to have some thoughts on failure itself, since this is something that came up earlier in the talks as well, both by the minister, by the DGE. So you ask a very first principles question. What is a key capability we need to survive and perhaps thrive in the VUCA world, in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world? One thing, and that is adaptiveness. If you don't adapt, you die. Simple as that, right? So the question then becomes, right, we need adaptive learners, and it's not just happening in education, it's happening in science, it's happening in industry, in businesses, in teams, in entrepreneurship. Everybody who wants to survive in an uncertain, changing world, they've got to build adaptiveness. Question is, how do we build adaptiveness? What drives adaptation? If you look at it at the fundamental core level. And my answer to that question, as you might have guessed, is failure. Failure is what drives adaptation. When you try a method, it doesn't work, it forces you to adapt. If you thought it was X, when in fact it was Y, it forces you to adapt. If you have a misconception that's obviously shown to be wrong, you're forced to adapt. If you thought you were polite and pleasant and you came across as rude, you're forced to adapt. Failure drives adaptation. And adaptation is not easy. It's hard. It's intentional. People don't want to do it. But failure drives the effort that makes you adapt. And that's how we close the loop. Deep learning is in that effort to make sense, to reorganize, to restructure your own learning and reach a new equilibrium. That deep effort is what results in deep learning. And you end up you're building two capacities, deep learning and learning adaptive skills, because that's what you're trained on. And back to then the question, do we wait for failure to happen, life to happen, to throw us these curveballs and hopefully we adapt and survive and thrive? Or do we intentionally design for it? And my motto is, let's intentionally design for failure to fight failure. What do you mean by fight failure? Not all failure is the same. I'm not suggesting failure in exams and when the stakes are high is okay. What I'm suggesting is if you want to reduce the likelihood of failure when it matters, what the science is suggesting, that use failure early on when you're first learning something, when the stakes are low, and that will help you learn deeply so that the likelihood of failure when it matters is actually reduced. Fighting failure with failure, right? And so one of the core fundamental capabilities, to answer the first question again, even more core than adaptability, is actually learning how to fail. We don't do that. We don't teach students. It's in the same way one must learn how to talk so that they can use talking to learn. Children need to do that. We have metrics and milestones for that. In the same way, children need to learn how to read so that they can use reading to learn. Now think about, we also need to teach learning how to fail in a safe way so that they can use failure for learning. And that's the core capability that I provoke you with. So as far as the work of teachers is concerned, I'm still a strong believer, and this is a mainstay. Teachers as designers is still the mainstay of teaching. You take the best of your content knowledge, you take the best of your science, hopefully, and then you take the best of the design sciences, the design of teaching, converting the science into design, in pursuit of the goals and the values that you have, and you design powerful learning environments. This is the basics of teaching, the technical, operational, logistical aspects of what we do as teachers day in, day out. This is what we do. And here you have good news. And this is the first mention of AI and technologies in my talk. Tomorrow you'll hear more. But the good news, very briefly, is AI is now able to do all of this. Curate content, take the latest science, learn from it, and implement designs for you so that the next time you go, you can actually say, well, build me a lesson on Roman history using productive failure principles at grade level. It will design generative activities for you. We are currently training models that can actually do that. Right? So that help is there. Imagine if you have that resource at your hand. Guys, that's the part. That's the future that I think about. But speaking of AI, one needs to talk a little bit about expertise as well. Because after all, we're in the business of building expertise. And people have studied experts for a long time. And yes, experts tend to know a lot of stuff. This is the explicit knowledge in the domain. These are the constructs, the rules, the grammar. This is the stuff you can talk about, you can write about, you can give a lecture. It's explicit, it's codifiable, it's represented externally. Right? This is the explicit knowledge. But that's not all what expertise is. It's also very tacit, intuitive, situational, deeply internalized knowledge that even experts do not know that they have, but it comes out when they act. Right? So to the extent, if our value proposition or our main work, if we continue to focus on explicit knowledge, we know that it can be codified. And if it can be codified, it will be automated and learned. So if your main value proposition as a teacher is transmission of explicit knowledge, I do not have good news for you. But if you really focus on the fundamentals and what really matters, it's real expertise development is the coupling between the tacit and the explicit. That's where we need to focus. That is not codifiable. My longtime colleague and mentor, John Seeley Brown, has a beautiful way of putting this. He talks about two kinds of learnings, just as an analytical dichotomy. There's learning about, and there's learning to be. You learn about math and science and history and geography. That's the explicit knowledge. But you learn to be like a mathematician, like a scientist, like a historian. That's the implicit. That's situated in the disciplinary practices of your domains. That's rich, contextual, situated knowledge that engages you in the practices of the domain. If that's what we can do, and couple that experience, that's really powerful. I think that's where squarely the work of the teacher lies, supported by AI. So be mindful, but there's also hope. A second thing about AI is personalization. People are talking about, the tech gurus especially, talking about this. Oh, AI in education, personalization is the holy grail. We can deliver best training and education tailored to the specific needs and preferences of the learner. Sounds like a good idea? No. It's a terrible idea. Let me explain. Personalization requires you know the vectors to personalize to, the parameters to personalize to. If you personalize to a child's preference of a learning style, oh, I'm visual, I'm kinesthetic, I'm so-and-so, study after study shows that that is not effective at all. So you shouldn't be personalizing to preference of a learning style. If you personalize to a child's attention span, oh, I can only read for 5 minutes at best. Oh, and ideally, not even reading, give me a TikTok video. That's not a good way to personalize, unless you want a generation of doctors and lawyers who can only attend to about 5 minutes at a time. So there are certain parameters that you really don't want to, because personalization is a double-edged sword. Luckily, in the science, we know the parameters that actually work. So it is good if you choose the right vectors, like prior knowledge, like your emotional and affective state, including your physiological state, some of the physiological state variables. Personalizing to those parameters in the right way is actually very productive. So again, it's a double-edged sword. But more generally, if you think about it, I have a bigger problem. I'm not a pessimist, but from a scientific standpoint, I have a problem. And here's the problem. If a child's learning experiences are fully personalized from day one till the end of schooling, $65 for this, bro. They will never learn to adapt. Because the environment is always adapting to them. And that would be the most terrible thing we can do to a child. Again, we should personalize, we should use these technologies, but let's not use it as, oh, personalization is monotonically good. Okay? So what awaits us, with just a couple of minutes left, is yes, we have strong AI-powered, personalized in the right way, scientifically sound learning models coming your way. And we can deliver them at scale. If you have the right data to compute on, large-scale, high-quality data to compute on, this can be immensely powerful because they can support the teacher in ways that was never thought possible. Then the question becomes, if that is the case, what is left for us as teachers to do? I think a lot. Number one, a scalpel is only as good as the surgeon who uses it. And if you look at the history of tool development and expertise in the domain, all domains develop new and advanced kinds of tools, sophisticated tools, and you need expertise, very deep expertise to understand and use these tools. The more advanced the instrument or the tool, the greater the burden on your domain knowledge, on your science, and on all your ability to orchestrate it. You need high level of expertise to use these tools. So the big part of the challenge for teachers, for us as teachers, is to really double down on our domain expertise, on our science, and try to understand these tools and how they can support us. That's the first thing. But there's an even bigger thing at play. If AI takes care of some of these basics, what is left for us is something very fundamental. Because what do teachers really do? We nurture, we care, we mentor, we motivate, we believe in our students, even when they don't believe in themselves, so that they can believe in themselves, to aspire, to dream, so that we can somehow play a role in setting them on the path to achieve those dreams, to fulfill their potential. That is the work that we do. And yesterday, just at the last minute, this is like 11 p.m. in the night when I'm preparing for this, I thought maybe I should check at MOE's website. What does MOE think our teachers do? And I opened the page, first paragraph. Do you know what it says? Some people are sweating. This is what it says. Exactly. That is the work. That page doesn't start with teachers need to be content experts, teachers need to know the science, teachers need to do this. No. It goes squarely on the fundamental nurturing and mentoring role of what teachers need to do. That's directly last night from the MOE's website. It kind of makes sense. I'm not saying the rest of it is not important, it's further down the page. But this is squarely. And why is this now even more important? Because there are sophisticated, very powerful technologies that can support in the rest of the work. And paradoxically, that pushes us to be even more human, to build that social connection. Because ultimately, to me, if you want to change education, the unit of change is not tools and technologies or methods and so what. No, the unit of change is only one and only one thing, and that is culture and communities. And teachers are the architects of that community. And if that's a vision we can work towards, if that's how the future unfolds, where AI supports us in orchestrating the things that we want to in very powerful ways, which leaves us as teachers the time to really do the essence, build community, build cultures that people want to be a part of. Now that's the future that I want to be a part of. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Manu, for that very engaging and insightful key address. Over the course of the next 2 days of TCEF 2025, participants will also have the privilege of attending 2 other keynote sessions. Professor Rose Luckin's Beyond the Algorithm, Practical AI Integration for Critical